My name is Marie Buntriani, and I'm the Dean of the G. Raymond Chang School of Continuing Education at Ryerson University. I'm delighted to welcome you all to our fourth Chang School Talks 2017 event. The theme of this year's Chang School Talks is 2030 Vision, Exploring the Past and Imagining the Future. In February, we featured a talk from Timothy Snyder, Husum Professor of History at Yale University, who helped us examine patterns of history and the current socio-political context. His latest book, 20 Lessons on Tyranny. In April, we welcomed Curtis Bonk, Professor of Instructional Systems Technology at Indiana University, who discussed new and innovative methods of learning. Earlier this month, the visionary Michael Serbinis, founder and CEO of Kobo and League, shared his experience as a tech entrepreneur. Today, we are absolutely thrilled to welcome a Canadian legend to the Chang School Talks stage, Dr. David Suzuki. I will be welcoming Dr. Suzuki to the stage momentarily. Throughout the event, I encourage you to tweet using the hashtag #ChangSchoolTalks. The hotel's guest Wi-Fi network is courtyard_conference. That's courtyard_conference, and the password is Ryerson 2017. I'm told all caps for Ryerson 2017. I would like to acknowledge a very few special guests we have in the audience with us. I mean, you're all special. These are very special. I'm delighted to welcome the Chang family, Donette Chin Loy Chang, Andrew Chang, and Bridget Chang Aduricio. The Chang family has a long-standing relationship with David and the David Suzuki Foundation. Donette and our school's late benefactor and namesake, Raymond Chang, first met David when he received an honorary doctorate from Ryerson University. The Changs and David bonded over a mutual appreciation for education and connecting students with the environment. Ray and Donette especially admired David's practical and critical vision of the world and how humans exist within it. Having grown up watching the nature of things, who hasn't, Bridget recalls being nervous upon first meeting David and his wife Tara when they once came over for dinner. She envisioned that he would talk a lot about technical science and lobbying efforts. However, she was surprised to find that he was very approachable and accessible, and spoke about fishing, traveling, and creating an urban national park so all people would have access to nature. The Chang family and David share a mutual belief that a better understanding of the world around you makes you more likely to want to preserve it. Thank you to the Chang family for making this afternoon's event possible. Now I would like to introduce our esteemed speaker, who will be offering his insights on how climate is changing. Dr. Suzuki is a scientist, broadcaster, author, and co-founder of the David Suzuki Foundation. He is companion to the Order of Canada and a recipient of UNESCO's Kalinga Prize for Science, the United Nations Environment Program Medal, the 2012 Inamori Ethics Prize, the 2009 Right Livelihood Award, and UNEP's Global 500. He is Professor Emeritus at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver and holds 29 honorary degrees from universities around the world, including Ryerson. Dr. Suzuki is familiar to television audiences as host of the CBC Science and Natural History television series, The Nature of Things, and to radio audiences as the original host of CBC Radio's Quirks and Quarks, as well as the acclaimed series, It's a Matter of Survival and From Naked Ape to Superspecies. In 1990, he co-founded the David Suzuki Foundation with Dr. Tara Koulis to collaborate with Canadians from all walks of life, including government and business, to conserve our environment and find solutions that will create a sustainable Canada, through science-based research, education, and policy work. His written work includes more than 55 books, 19 of them for children. Dr. Suzuki lives with his wife and family in Vancouver, BC. And just last week, he was inducted into Canada's Walk of Fame. Congratulations of this achievement, Dr. Suzuki.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that over-generous introduction. I'm delighted to be here today and to remember Ray, who I came to know originally as someone who might help us do some of our work, but I came to admire him, and I feel that it was a privilege to know him as a friend. And thank you for being a part of today's meeting and arranging this. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the Chang family. Before I begin, I'd like to remind you that we're meeting on the territory of the Huron-Wendat First Nations and the Mississauga of New Credit First Nations. Just to remind you that for thousands of years there were people here who took care of the land, and we should remember that. I also, ever since Mr. Harper became Prime Minister, I've had to preface my remarks by saying I'm not here to speak on behalf of any organization like the David Suzuki Foundation or any political party like the Greens or any corporation or any other group. I'm speaking today as an individual. I speak to you as a scientist, as a grandfather, and as an elder. I think it's important for you to know why I say those things. As a scientist, I am sufficiently aware of the scientific literature to know that we're headed on a very dangerous path, and that the evidence is there. As a grandfather, I know very well that the world I knew as a child is no longer here for my grandchildren, and there's something wrong with that. When every generation throughout time was working towards making a better opportunity for each successive generation. And that bothers me a great deal. But as an elder, I believe that this is the most important part of my life. You see, as an elder, I don't have to play games anymore. I'm not looking for a job or a raise or a promotion. I'm not after more fame or money or power. So it frees me then to speak the truth from my heart. And if it offends people, that's their problem, not mine. It's a very important position to be in. But I also believe that elders have something no other group in society has. We've lived an entire lifetime. We've made mistakes, had a few successes, I hope, and suffered failures. We've learned a lot. Those are life lessons. And I think it's my job, and every elder's job now, to sift through that lifetime of experience, to gain the nuggets of experience that we must pass on to the coming generations. So I always tell my fellow elders, get the hell off the couch. Don't watch so much television, accept the nature of things. Don't play any more golf. Get on with the most important part of your life. Looking back now, I feel at this stage of my life a very strong sense of urgency. And the urgency comes from having lived an entire lifetime. I knew, or I had heard of global warming in the 1970s. But I remember writing an article back then that said, we're going to have to deal with this problem of global warming, but it's a slow motion catastrophe. I just didn't think that we would have to be worried about it as soon as it's come to be a problem. I was more interested in questions of clear-cut logging, of degradation of the ocean, of toxic pollution. Those were what the factors or the issues I was concerned with throughout the 70s and the 80s. I want to remind you that in 1974, well, 73, end of 73, the OPEC oil embargo hit. And for those of you that can remember that time, it was a very frightening time as we realized how dependent we were on the import of oil. And the lineups of cars at the gas pump, the price of gasoline just shot sky high. Of course, in the United States, the way they did is they lined up and started shooting each other to get at the gas pumps. It was a very frightening time, and we, Canada, set up a commission under the guidance of Dr. Ursula Franklin, one of Canada's distinguished scientists, to say, what do we do to confront this whole energy issue in the 1970s. In 1978, she finished her study that came out as a document called Canada as a Conserver Society. And what she said is we've got to be much more careful with the resources that we use. We've got to stop wasting so much, be much more efficient in what we use, and we should put an effort into renewable energy to become a global leader in renewable energy. 1978. And what did we do? Countries like Denmark and Germany took the OPEC oil embargo very seriously, and they went into wind farms and windmills. They went into solar energy. Canada said, thank you, Dr. Franklin, put the study on the shelf and promptly forgot it. In 1988, I went for the first time to Australia as a guest of the Commission for the Future, which was a new organization that the government had set up to look at the impact of science and technology and where the country was heading into the future. And for the first time, I met climatologists who showed me the data they were getting. And for me, that was the first time I thought, oh my goodness, we've got to work on this immediately. We can't wait around. It was by then becoming clear the evidence was in, and it was very serious. In 1988, in fact, the issue of the environment had reached its absolute pinnacle. A guy ran for president of the United States in 1988 and said, if you vote for me, I will be an environmental president. Anyone here want to guess who that was? Bush Sr. George H.W. Bush, there wasn't a green bone in his body. But he said it because Americans had put the issue of the environment at the top of the agenda. 1988, Brian Mulroney was reelected. And to show he cared about the environment, he appointed his brightest political star to be the Minister of the Environment. Anyone remember who that was? That was Lucien Bouchard. I interviewed Lucien Bouchard 3 months later, and I said, Mr. Bouchard, what do you think is the most important issue Canadians confront? And right away he said, global warming. That was impressive. I said, how serious a problem is it? And these are his exact words. It threatens the survival of our species. We must act now. 1988. 1988, Hare, Dr. Hare, what was his first name? Ken Hare, called 300 climatologists to the University of Toronto to a conference. And at the end of the conference, their press release said, the evidence is in. Human beings are causing global warming. And this represents a threat to human survival second only to nuclear war. And they called for a 20% reduction in 15 years in greenhouse gas emissions. So there it was. The scientists said the evidence was in, and they set a target for us to try to achieve. Had we done that, we would be so far along the line now towards a renewable future. Again, Brian Mulroney then set up a committee to say, can it be done? Could we reduce our energy use by, or our emissions by 20% in 15 years, and how much would it cost? That committee report came back and said, yes, we could do it, but it will cost over $70 billion. But we would save a net $150 billion in health costs, in the wear and tear of buildings, and all of that. When you added it all up, we would save tens of billions of dollars. That report was never released. The reason it wasn't released is that Mr. Mulroney saw that, and he understood that he would have to take a beating for saying, we've got to spend $70 billion now. And he wouldn't be in office 15 years later to brag about the great savings he had made for Canadians. And this is the problem. The political process demands that when you are elected to office, your highest priority is getting reelected. which means whatever you do must pay off before the next election. And an issue like climate change had simply become too great for any politician to stake their career on a serious commitment to reducing the energy use. We then sailed in 1992 in preparation for a major conference on the environment in Rio. That would get the largest gathering of scientists, of heads of state ever in human history. In preparation for that, this remarkable document was released. It's called World Scientists' Warning to Humanity. It was signed by more than 1,700 leaders, scientific leaders, including over half of all Nobel Prize winners alive at that time, signed the document. And let me just read a few lines from this document. 1992. Human beings in the natural world are on a collision course. Human activities inflict harsh and often irreversible damage on the environment and on critical resources. If not checked, many of our current practices put at serious risk the future we wish for human society, and may so alter the living world that it will be unable to sustain life in the manner that we know. Fundamental changes are urgent if we are to avoid the collision our present course will bring about. And then they go on and list the areas of the collision: the atmosphere, water resources, oceans, soil, forests, species, and population. And then the words grow even more bleak. This is 1992. No more than one or a few decades remain before the chance to avert the threats we now confront will be lost, and the prospects for humanity immeasurably diminished. A great change in our stewardship of the earth and life on it is required if vast human misery is to be avoided and our global home on this planet is not to be irretrievably mutilated. And then they list the 5 things that must be started immediately. This is an amazing document. Scientists, as a rule, don't sign or write such powerful statements or calls to action. It is very unusual. And I'm sure many of you know that this year, on the 25th anniversary of the publication of this document, 15,000 scientists have now signed a second version of World Scientists' Warning to Humanity. And all of the issues that were raised in this document are still here, except they're worse. So in 1992, George Bush, this great guy that cared about the environment, said, "I'm not going to the Rio conference unless you water down the target." Now, in 1988, the target had been 20% reduction in 15 years. Now, climatologists were saying, let's use 1990 as a baseline, and George Bush said, you got to water that target down. And so we will stabilize 1990 levels by the year 2000. And so he reluctantly came. Americans were humiliated to have him come and force that change on the conference. We went into 1997 with the Kyoto conference, and there, thanks to Al Gore, a deal was brokered at the last minute, where the industrialized nations all said, we caused the problem. It wasn't China or India or any of the African countries. It was us in the industrialized world. We created the problem. It's our responsibility to cap and then reduce our emissions. So by the year 2010, then our emissions would be down 5 to 6% below 1990 levels. And then we can ask India and China and all the other countries to come into a global agreement. As soon as Kyoto was over, Alberta and the oil industries were saying, that's not fair. How come we have to do this and India and China don't have to? They didn't create the problem. We were the ones that created it. And then Canadians started saying, yeah, but we're only 2% of global emissions. Yeah, but we're only 0.4% of global population. We're already producing a disproportionate amount. People kept saying, well, it's not fair and we're just a tiny player. And I kept saying, look, we're one of the richest countries in the world. We're telling India and China, don't do what we've already done. Why should they pay any attention to us if we don't demonstrate that we're doing that first? We've got to be the model so that the others, we have credibility in asking the rest of the world to reduce their emissions. 2001, Jean Chrétien ratified Kyoto on behalf of Canada. And we're very proud at our foundation of a letter he wrote to us after he ratified, thanking us for the work we had done that made his job easier to actually ratify and commit Canada to the Kyoto target. Unfortunately, neither he nor Paul Martin, when he became Prime Minister, they understood the challenge that Canada made a commitment, and then they did nothing serious about meeting that commitment. And as you know, when Mr. Harper was elected, then he really began, I don't think he ever let the words climate change leave his lips. He just didn't want, he carried out a pogrom against environmentalists and anybody saying that we had to do something about climate change. Anyway, I won't tell you the stories about what he did. He was a very, very small man, but he had a vision, and I've said over and over again, I believe that he should be in jail. Because what he did was called willful blindness. He deliberately avoided the discussion about an issue that probably affects Canadians more than any other industrialized nation. Canada's a northern country. Inuit have been telling us for 40 years that it's warming up. They can see the changes that are going on. We know that Canada has the longest marine coastline of any country in the world. Sea level rise, from first the warming of the oceans, that you get thermal expansion, and then when the great ice sheets of Antarctica and of Greenland fall into the oceans, we're going to get sea level rise in meters. And then you think of all of the climate-related activities like agriculture, forestry, fisheries, tourism, winter sports. They're all going to be hammered by climate change, and to have a prime minister for 9.5 years not dealing with the issue, trying to clamp down so that Canadians don't know about what the issues are, I believe was criminal. Especially, it's an intergenerational crime, because what we've done is left the problems to future generations, and that's simply not right. And then, as you know, Mr. Harper, first, he modified the baseline. We always used to say 1990 levels, we've got to reduce below the 1990 levels. Harper then said, no, 2005 is our baseline. So he allowed 15 years of continued greenhouse gas emissions, and then said, we're going to take everything relative to 2005, and we're going to try to reduce emissions. He then, as you all know, pulled Canada out of the Kyoto Agreement, the only country that signed Kyoto to pull out of the treaty. What kind of a country are we that sign international agreements and then don't feel bound to meet those agreements and ultimately simply pull out? In 2015, of course, the sun came out. Who could have believed that Justin Trudeau would become Prime Minister? I felt he was still a bit green. He needed another term to just learn the ropes. But no, this young guy got in, and I like to think that it's because many of us voted strategically. I voted Liberal for the first time in my life, just because I did not want Mr. Harper to get back in. And he performed magnificently when he got in, Mr. Trudeau. The first thing, I have 4 daughters, and for him to say gender equity in cabinet was, to me, a huge, huge decision. And I was so proud of him for doing that. And then he went straight, in 2 months, he went straight to Paris. You know, this young prime minister went to Paris, not only declared that Canada was back, and signed the Paris Agreement with a flourish. He said, we aspire to keeping temperatures rising much above 1.5 degrees. The Paris target says 2. He said, we prefer it to be closer than 1.5. And boy, oh boy, did we pound our chests, and I wrote article after article saying how great this was. But the easiest thing in the world is saying things. The hard thing is doing things that live up to our promises. And I am afraid that Mr. Trudeau gets a big fat F for his performance in terms of the actual commitments we've now made. At the same time that I just wanted to give you a brief history to show you what's happened to this. We've known about climate change now for over 30 years as a serious issue we've got to deal with. And look at what we have done. Our emissions have continued to climb steadily. And we haven't made the big steps, taken the big decisions to show that we're getting off the trajectory we're on. And what has happened? Now scientists are debating. We are living in a period called the Anthropocene epoch. You know, the geological ages of the Earth are written by different big events. And you have the Eocene and the Miocene and the Holocene. They're all marked by triggering events. We now, and scientists are debating, when did the Anthropocene epoch start? And it sounds like it's between 1945 and 1950, that this is going to be the beginning of what they call the age of human beings. When we have become the major force altering, shaping the chemical, physical, and biological properties of the planet on a geological scale. This is that moment. The problem is we have become very powerful, but we don't know enough to be able to use the power we've acquired in a way that is truly sustainable. We have no idea how to do that. And in the process of living as we do, we are undermining the very things that keep us alive. How on earth did we get to this point where we, one species, have become such a powerful force? There has never been a single species able to alter the properties of the planet as we are doing today. Never. So, you know, I was interested that in this lecture series, you've had historians coming. How does history help us when we have an absolutely unprecedented, unique event happen? I don't know how much history can guide us, except tell us maybe about our inability to meet events of this magnitude. How did we get to this point of being the dominant creature? So as a geneticist, I've been very, very intrigued with the way that scientists can now use DNA, the genetic material, and track the movement of human beings across the planet over time. It's a very tricky way of using the DNA, and it's very exciting intellectually. All of the trails lead back to Africa 150,000 years ago. That was our birthplace. And I keep waiting for the Ku Klux Klan to invite me to give a lecture so I can tell them, we're all Africans, for God's sake, what's your problem? That was our birthplace. And if we try to imagine what Africa must have looked like 150,000 years ago, it was filled with animals in abundance and diversity beyond anything that you would see today in the Serengeti. It was a magnificent, magnificent continent. And human beings popped up in just little clumps of 4 or 5 or 6 of these funny-looking, two-legged, furless apes, and that was us. Now, I'm absolutely sure none of the other animals on the plains of Africa trembled when they saw us and said to their kids, shh, don't piss them off, they're going to take over the planet. We were a very unimpressive animal. There weren't many of us, we weren't very big, we weren't fast, we weren't strong, we didn't have special sensory ability. You know, I keep trying to imagine swinging through the trees without glasses. Man, oh man, I'd be dead in no time. We were not a very impressive animal. But we did have one thing going for us that was hidden. It was a 2-kilogram organ buried deep in our skulls. The human brain. That was our advantage. And boy, what an amazing thing that was. That brain conferred a massive memory capacity. No other animal has the memory capacity of a human brain. We were curious. We were observant, and we remembered. We were creative. We were inventive. We learned by trial and error. That was a huge, huge leg up for us as a species. And that brain did something no other species has ever done. It invented an idea or a concept called the future. The future doesn't exist. The only thing that exists is now and what we remember from the past. But because we invented the notion of a future, we're the only animal that realized we can affect the future by what we do now. Based on our knowledge and our experiences, we could see or project into the future where the dangers lie and where there are opportunities. And we could deliberately now choose a path to avoid dangers and exploit opportunities. I believe foresight was the great gift that the brain conferred on us that gave us a big advantage. And you think about it, it was very, very simple. You're walking down a path and you come to a branch in the path and you go, oh God, I remember I went to the right and I ran into a saber-toothed tiger, damn near killed me. But I went off to the left about 2 years ago and I found something good to smoke. So I'm going left. There was that kind of thing, right? It's not anything profound, but based on what you know, you made choices. And that brought us to the point we're at now. I'm not a Christian, but I know in the Bible that the importance of foresight is right there in the stories. Remember Joseph, who got sold to the Egyptians by his jealous siblings, and he had this ability to read dreams. And the Pharaoh came to trust him and told him about his dreams, and Joseph said, we're heading for a famine. You better start setting aside grain. And sure enough, the famine came, and they survived 7 years of famine because of their foresight that Joseph had. And, Noah, the same thing. I mean, Noah's just a carpenter, and his voice comes and says, build an ark. And he's going, but I'm just a carpenter. Build an ark. But my neighbors will laugh at me. Build an ark and put plants and animals in it because there's a flood coming. And he and his family survived. So those parables, those stories in books like the Bible just reinforce the importance of foresight, of looking ahead. And so now we've come to where we are the dominant animal on the planet. And we have all of the advanced ability to look ahead. We call them scientists. We call them supercomputers. And with that ability, we've had scientists like the ones I just read in the World Scientist Warning to Humanity that have been telling us for decades, we are heading along a very dangerous path. And we have to change directions if we are to avoid anything really catastrophic. And now we are turning our backs on the very survival strategy that got us to this point. And it's what is blocking us from using our foresight and acting on it is politics and economics. They are the major factors. We had it in spades with Mr. Harper. Over and over again, he said, we can't do anything about greenhouse gas emissions. It'll destroy the economy. And so, first of all, it wasn't true. And, this is a thing that really pisses me off about Harper, is that he claims his big thing is economics. And yet he never mentioned that Sweden imposed a carbon tax in the 1990s of $130 a ton. Mr. Trudeau is finally putting one on at $30 a ton starting. Sweden had one at $130 a ton, and they increased that to $160 in 2008, and now it's I think it may be close to $200 a ton. And during the time of that first tax period, their economy grew by 40%. So this business of Mr. Harper is his great manager of the economy and saying that you can't impose a tax, it'll destroy the economy. He doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. And Besides which, what he's doing by saying that is saying that the economy has become more important than the very atmosphere that gives us air, gives us the weather and climate and the seasons. That, it seems to me, is nuts to elevate the economy above that. So I believe that what's happened then through that history I've just recounted of the warnings starting and getting more stronger, starting in the late 80s, we were told and knew that the science was in. And look at what's happened during all that time, ending up in the United States, the most powerful country in the world, electing a man who is absolutely nuts, who calls climate change a hoax. Every single one of the Republican candidates for that office was a climate denier. Now we look down there and go, oh, those bloody Americans are so stupid. Just remind you, Mr. Harper was our prime minister and never talked about climate change. And how many people ran to replace Mr. Harper? 13? Everyone but one. What was his name? Michael Chang. Yeah, Michael Chong. Every one of the others, including Mr. Scheer, who is now the leader of the Conservatives, was a climate denier. So I don't think we can look down in the States and think, oh, those poor Americans. We know what it's like to live with that. What I believe, we have a very short window. An article came out in Nature, one of the prominent scientific journals, Nature Climate Change, that said we are on a trajectory at the current levels of increase to reach 4 degrees rise by 2100. Now, I personally think a 2-degree rise by 2100 we can't imagine what the impact will be. But we're on a trajectory for a 4-degree rise by 2100. They say in this article there's a 5% chance of keeping it to 2 degrees by the end of this century. I was shocked that we even have a 5% chance. But what that says is there's this very short window where we can actually do something to try to keep temperature rising above 2 degrees. We have a 10% chance, that's twice as much chance, of reaching 6 degrees this century. To me, 4 to 6 degrees, I cannot imagine human beings could survive a change that great. So we are on a trajectory right now in which there's a much greater chance of 6 degrees than 2 degrees, where we could very well become extinct as a species. So and the opportunity to do something has just become very, very short. We can't fool around anymore. And we've been told for years, look, you're all consumers. It's up to you what you buy, what you ride. Turn out the lights and put in LEDs and get an electric car. And yes, it's up to you. Bullshit. Yes, we all have a role to play, but there are some big decisions that have to be made right now. And one is we've got to get off fossil fuels. And that means no more pipelines, no more dams like the one at Site C on the Peace, because that valley has to be the breadbasket of the North. We can't tolerate a food chain in which food is grown 4,000 miles from where it's eaten. All of that depends on fossil fuels to get food to where it's going to be consumed. The Peace Valley should be the breadbasket of the North. We have to eat much more locally and much more seasonally. When I was a boy and I wanted to have fruit or vegetables in the winter, my mom said, go to the canned goods section. Now our kids want fresh raspberries and strawberries and tomatoes. Where the hell do we grow that in Canada in the middle of winter? But we can't go on living that way. There have to be some big changes that are made, and they're not being made. And so I believe that we need to have a government that intends to live up to what its promises were. And I've said out to the public, Trudeau's a liar. Trudeau's a liar because he told us before he was elected that he was going to change the electoral system. that we would never have a first-past-the-post election. Once he was elected, he again said several times, this is the last election of the first-past-the-post system. And then he withdrew from that. Now, I personally, my mother and father were born and raised in Canada. They couldn't vote until 1948 because they were still considered hyphenated Canadians, Japanese Canadians. Indigenous people couldn't vote till 1960, the original peoples of this country. I've taken the right to vote very, very seriously and have voted in every single election. And until the last election, I never voted for a party that won power. So my vote for all of those years has basically been wasted because we have a first-past-the-post system. So when Trudeau ran promising, I even voted Liberal for heaven's sakes, but it was more to keep Harper out than to get Justin in. But I took that promise very, very seriously. And he lied to us. He said he was going to do it, and he didn't. So what does that mean then? We need big decisions to be made at the government level. And right now, governments run on what is basically a corporate agenda, on the assumption that what's good for corporations is good for us. And we know now that Exxon, for example, has known for over 30 years through its own scientists that burning fossil fuels is creating climate change. And yet for all of that time, Exxon, their PR campaign has been to say, this is junk science. This isn't true, it's a part of a natural process. Corporations exist for one reason and one reason only, to make money. And that's fair enough. But don't then think that corporations are going to do something different because they care about people or they care about First Nations communities. Nonsense. Their concern is to make money. And to counter that, we elect people to office so that our concerns can be expressed by the people that we elect to office. So right now, what is the big challenge we confront? Get involved in the democratic process. When 40 or 50% of us aren't voting, we don't have a democracy anymore. And I believe we've got to all, if we care about our children and grandchildren, we have to be the warriors on behalf of the coming generations. And anytime there's a politician in our reach out and tell them what we care about and ask them, what are you going to do about protecting a future for my children? We've got to put it back on the agenda. And the only way we can do that is, I believe, by grassroots mobilization and campaigning through the democratic process. That's the end of my speech. Now I just want to tell you a few stories before I end and turn over to some questions. And in my old age, that's what I seem to become, a storyteller. And the first story was when I was contacted by the Nalaka Pamux people in Lytton, British Columbia, in the 1980s, and they said, would I help them prevent logging in their sacred valley called the Stein Valley? And I said, well, I'll consider it, but first I want to go camping and see what I'm going to be fighting for. So I took my family camping in the Stein Valley for a week, and it is a magnificent, absolutely magnificent valley. But the BC government had given Fletcher Challenge, a New Zealand forest company, a permit to log the Stein Valley. So what the Nalaka Pamux people wanted to do was start a campaign to prevent logging in the valley. And so we were coming out of the valley, and after 7 days you smell like smoke and all kinds of other stuff. You're pretty grubby. But at the trail's head, we met this huge party of people, and they were obviously not going camping. The women were dressed in high heels and skirts, and the men were dressed in suits and ties. But when you're on a trail, you immediately stop and you chit-chat, and oh yeah, what are you doing? And very quickly, I realized, my God, one of these guys is CEO of Fletcher Challenge, a company that's going to log the valley. And very quickly, he realized, oh my God, this is that shit disturber, David Suzuki. So, needless to say, within a few minutes, what began as, oh, hello, how are you, escalated until we were shouting at each other. And finally, in frustration, he said, listen, Suzuki, Tree huggers like you willing to pay for those trees? Because if you're not willing to pay for them, they don't have any value till someone cuts them down. And that was an epiphany for me. I went, oh my God, he's absolutely right. In our system, the fact that the Nlaka'pamux people regard that valley as sacred has absolutely no basis in the economy. Who cares whether it's sacred? And that was borne out recently, last week, by the Supreme Court of Canada. You know, there was an indigenous group in southeastern British Columbia that applied to stop a logging, skiing development in their mountains because to them, grizzly bears are sacred. They're venerated, and they didn't want their habitat threatened. And the Supreme Court said, look, that's about your belief, that's got nothing to do with the law. And they rejected their suit. Where is a place for the sacred in our society? And then the reason I was fighting for that valley is that all of the trees and the green things in the valley are taking carbon out of the air and putting oxygen back in it. Not a bad thing for an animal like us. If all the plants in the world weren't doing that, we wouldn't be here. And yet, when you say to the forestry company, listen, when you cut down those trees, what about the photosynthesis that's lost? And their answer is, that's an externality. That's got nothing to do. We're talking economics. The economy regards that as something irrelevant to the economic system. That forest is lifting millions of gallons of water out of the soil, transpiring it into the air, and modulating weather and climate. It's an externality. The trees cling to the soil, so when it rains, the soil doesn't run into the salmon spawning grounds. That's an externality. That forest, as long as it's intact, is habitat for countless species of fungi and bacteria and insects and birds and mammals. None of that registers in the economic system. So arguing with the CEO of the forest company, I'm having to run around going, well, okay, you can talk about the number of board feet of timber and cubic meters of pulp and jobs and profit. Well, you can pick berries. We can sell the berries. And what about salal bushes? We could put them in flower arrangement and maybe we'll discover a cure for cancer. You see, the system is rigged. If we have to argue in economic terms, we're going to lose every time because the reason we're fighting for those things doesn't register in the economic system. I'd like to reinforce that idea by telling you that I've lived in the same house in Vancouver for 45 years. And it's a wonderful part of Vancouver, and I believe very much that one of the key things about finding a place and living sustainably is to stay put. You put your roots down and you stay and fight for the place that you're staying. So I've stayed put in the same house for 45 years. And we live right on the ocean in right downtown Vancouver. In the 1990s, Hong Kong was going to revert back to China. And there was a lot of money in Hong Kong scared shitless about what's going to happen when China takes over. So I got a letter in the mail from a real estate agent saying, offshore money is pouring into Vancouver. Now is a good time to sell your property and buy up. I'd never even heard the notion of buying up. But apparently what you do is you buy a small home, which is a starter home, and then or house, and then you sell that and get a bigger house, and that's buying up. That's what you're supposed to do. And that made me very angry because I thought that's crazy. And so I thought, okay, if I was going to sell my home, what would I put down that would make it valuable or worthwhile? And the first thing I wrote down was that when I was married, I fell in love with my wife's mother and dad, and I invited them, when he retired, to come and live with us. And I never imagined they would live as long as they did. 35 years later, But I put that down because my children have known Grandma and Granddad upstairs their entire lives. And that, to me, was priceless. My father was a kitchen cabinet maker, and when Tara and I were first married, he built a kitchen cabinet for our apartment. And when I bought this house, I ripped the cabinet out and put it in the new house. Looks like hell, it doesn't belong. But every time I open the door to that cupboard, I think of my father, and I put that down. And even in Vancouver, there's roadkill. Over the years, my daughters have dragged in dead snakes and birds and squirrels, and they have an animal cemetery under the dogwood tree, and I put that down. My father-in-law was an avid gardener. I went down to the States for a month on a tour and came back exhausted, and the first person I met was my father-in-law, and he said, "David, you know the asparagus I planted is for you." And so I saved the first crop that came off till you got home, and here it is. And I put that down as making my house my home. My best friend came out from Toronto and spent a week with us. I was building a new fence along the water, and he spent 3 days carving a handle to put on that gate. He's a lousy carpenter, but I put it on, and when I changed the gate, I put his handle there. Because every time I open the gate, I think of my best friend. And I put that down. And when my mother died in 1984, I took Mom's ashes and put them on a clematis plant that grows along the fence. And then my niece Janice died very unexpectedly, and we put Janice's ashes on there. And every spring when the flowers bloom, I know that my mother and my niece are there with me. And so I made that list of what makes my place my home. And to me, those are priceless. But on the market, they're worthless. And this is the thing that really, we don't put the values on things the way they should be. The things that really matter. And I've only lived in my house for 45 years. I think of indigenous people around the world who've lived in place for thousands of years, where rocks and trees and mountains and boulders and streams are sacred. You think of what a radically different way those things are to them. And yet in our economic system, they don't register. Let me tell you 2 more stories, then I'll quit. My great hero, my inspiration, was my father. And in 1984, he was dying. 94. He was dying, and I moved in to care for him the last month of his life. And I'm so grateful he wasn't in pain. He knew he was dying. He wasn't afraid. And that was one of the happiest periods I ever spent with my father. He kept saying over and over again, "David, I die a rich man." And I could never understand that. He didn't have a penny to his name. Tara and I have been supporting him for many, many years. But we laughed and we cried, and he never once said, "Do you remember that closet full of fancy clothes?" He never said, "Do you remember that big car I bought in 1990 or the house we owned in London, Ontario?" That's just stuff. All he talked about with me was family and friends and neighbors and the things we did together. To my father, that was his wealth. And indeed, he was a very rich man. And I thought about that at the end of his life, my father's pride and joy, what filled him with happiness, was the things he did with other people. And we've kind of got off on this weird idea that stuff, that money and what it can buy is what is the most important thing in life. And I can tell you, it's not. By the way, is that Don Guichon over there? No, it's not. Okay. Looks no, the guy looking around, you look identical to a student of mine 40 years ago. And the last story I want to tell you is, as you may know, I and the David Suzuki Foundation have been fighting the Alberta tar sands for many years. We believe that it should be shut down. This is a crazy way to get our energy. And 4 years ago, I got a call from a man who said, he identified himself, he was the CEO of one of the largest companies in the Alberta tar sands, could I come and talk to you? I said, of course. I said, I'm not into fighting. Yes, I'd be happy to see you. And he showed up the next day, and I thanked him profusely and said how honored I was and blah, blah, blah. And I said, look, before you come into my office, please, I want you to do me one favor. I want you to leave your identity as a CEO of an oil company outside the door. I want to meet you man to man, human being to human being. Because quite frankly, Mr. CEO, I said, I don't see the point of talking about the tar sands or energy policy or any of that until you and I first sit down and agree on what life is about, what matters most, and then we can build up there. But if we don't have that agreement, what the hell, we're just all over the map. Now, I could see from his body language he was not happy with this idea, but to his credit, he came in the door and sat down. And I said, I thank you for doing that. I said, I know that this is not what you expected, so let me explain what I'm going to present. I said, we live in a world that is created, that is constrained by laws of nature. There's nothing we can do about it. Those laws apply, and we can't do anything beyond those laws. In physics, we know through physics, you can't build a rocket that will travel faster than the speed of light. We know the law of gravity. It says if I trip on that stair, I'm going to hit my head on the floor. We know the first and second laws of thermodynamics tell us you can't build a perpetual motion machine. Those are dictated to us by physics, and we live within those constraints. We understand that. In chemistry, it's the same. The atomic properties of the elements determines their freezing points, their melting points, their boiling points, their reaction rates, the diffusion constants. Those are all determined by the properties of the atoms, and chemists know what they can or cannot put together and the kind of molecules they can synthesize. That's dictated by the laws of chemistry, and we have to live with that. And in biology, it's the same. Every species of plant and animal has a maximum number that can be sustained indefinitely. Exceed that number, your population will crash. That number is set by what is called the carrying capacity of an ecosystem or a habitat. That's just a simple law of biology. Now, people say, well, but we're not like other species. We're smart. We adapt to different habitats or ecosystems, and it's true. We're not bound by ecosystems or habitats. But our home is still the biosphere. That's that zone of air, water, and life where all water and air, where all life exists. That's our habitat, the biosphere. And the late Carl Sagan used to tell us, if you reduce the Earth to the size of a basketball, the biosphere, where all living things exist, would be thinner than a layer of saran wrap. And that's it. That's our habitat, and that has a carrying capacity for human beings. The number of humans that can be carried indefinitely depends on our number and our per capita consumption. So you have to factor those two things in to tell what can be sustained indefinitely, and all indications show clearly we are far beyond the carrying capacity of the biosphere. And even if we compensate and if we all lived the way people live in Bangladesh or Somalia, we are still overpopulated. We're the most numerous mammal that's ever been on this planet, 7 billion of us. And when I say this, politicians and business people get very angry at me. You know, how dare you say we're past the carrying capacity of the planet? Look at our stores, they're filled with stuff. Look at our people, we're living longer, there's never been as many people. Yeah, we're maintaining the notion that everything is fine by using up the rightful legacy of our children and grandchildren. Talk to any elder in this room. What was it like in the world when you were a child? And every one of them will say, it used to be so different. There used to be birds that would darken the sky for hours on end. Rivers used to be jammed with fish at certain times of the year. Birds would fly over in a migration in numbers you can't even imagine today. All over the world, our elders tell us that they inform us that we're living in a way that is using up what rightfully should be passed on from generation to generation. So I said to the CEO, you and I forget that we are animals. I never realized how controversial that idea is. In the 1990s, I was asked to speak at the first annual meeting of Green Builders in Austin, Texas. 3,000 people, hundreds of children sitting at the front of the room. And I said, now kids, if you remember one thing from my speech, remember we are animals. My God, did their parents get angry at me? This woman came up, don't you call my daughter an animal. We're human beings. I said, madam, I'm really sorry. If your daughter isn't an animal, she must be a plant. Because we're either animals or plants. And I said, Mr. CEO, as an animal, what is the most important thing every human being needs? And instead of giving an answer as every one of you would, he went, well, and I could see he was thinking a job, money. I said, Mr. CEO, if you don't have air for 3 minutes, you're dead. If you have to breathe polluted air, you're sick. So I'm asking you, would you not agree with me? Air is sacred. And that clean air should be a responsibility every one of us has as a living organism to protect clean air. And then I said, you and I, we're 60 to 70% water by weight. We're basically a big blob of water with enough thickener added, we don't dribble away on the floor. But, you know, we do dribble away. It comes out of our skin and our eyes and our mouth and our crotch, and we lose water all the time. I said, Mr. CEO, if you don't have water for 4 to 6 days, you're dead. If you have to drink polluted water, you're sick. So isn't clean water then sacred? And our sacred responsibility is to protect clean water at all costs above anything else. And then food is a little different. You and I could last quite a bit longer, 4 to 6 weeks without food, and we'll die. If we have to eat contaminated food, we'll sicken. And most of our food still does come from the soil. So can we not say clean food and soil joins clean water and clean air? And all of the energy in our bodies that we need to do work, to grow, to reproduce, all of that energy is sunlight. Sunlight captured by plants in photosynthesis, converted into chemical energy. We get that by eating plants or eating animals that eat the plants, and we store that energy in our bodies. And when we need to work or move, we burn those molecules of energy and release the sun's energy back out into our bodies. And all of the fuels that we burn, coal, oil, gas, dung, peat, wood, all of that is sunlight. We release sunlight when we burn them. So photosynthesis then should be up there with clean soil and food, clean water, and clean air. Those 4 elements are what indigenous people call the 4 sacred elements: earth, air, fire, and water. And I said, Mr. CEO, the miracle to me of our lives on this planet is that those 4 elements, those life-giving elements, are cleansed, replenished, renewed, created by the web of living things. All of the energy, as I say, is created by or captured by photosynthesis in plants. In Vancouver, we get our water from 3 watersheds surrounded by old-growth rainforest. When it rains, the tree roots and soil fungi and bacteria filter the water, and you can drink it right straight away. Life filters the water and makes it potable for an animal like us. And all of the atmosphere, of course, before plants, there was no oxygen in the air. Plants create the atmosphere we depend on, and every bit of our food was once alive. And as I say, most was grown in the soil. And as you know, without life, you can't have soil. That's why when Matt Damon was stranded on Mars in the movie The Martian, you remember there's lots of dust and sand and clay. There is no soil, because soil is created by life. In order for him to grow his potatoes on Mars, He had to dig a hole and then put poop in it and then add his potatoes. Life creates the very soil on which we grow our food. And I said, Mr. CEO, I believe those are the foundation for all human beings. Clean air, clean water, clean soil and food, clean energy, and diversity of living things. I said other things, the lines we draw around our property, our cities, our provinces, our countries, nature couldn't care less about those boundaries. They don't mean anything. We go to war, we will kill and die to protect those boundaries. Nature doesn't care. I always go to Alberta and say, look, you want to dig up the tar sands, you go ahead, burn it. You want to do that, fine. As long as whatever you do stays in Alberta, go ahead. Well, of course, it doesn't work that way because it's one system around the world. So borders, boundaries don't mean anything in this conversation. And other things, capitalism, the economy, the market, corporations, these are not forces of nature. We invented them. 300 years ago, people believed in dragons and demons and monsters, and we took them very, very seriously. I mean, if we thought dragons were coming, man, we'd give them gold or jewels or sacrifice virgins. We'd do anything to placate the... Well, but now we know that, the dragons were just a figment of our imagination. But then we go and replace it with another figment of our imagination called the economy or the market. This is nuts. I was talking to oh God, I keep forgetting his name. Who's the conservative in Alberta? That's no. The one, Preston Manning. Preston and I get along very well. He's a real conservative. But anyway, we're chatting away, and then I said, well, the market, and the minute I said the market, his eyes went, the market, hallelujah, praise the market, free the market, let the market do its, what the hell? The market's a human invention. It's like a dragon, for God's sake. And we're going to sacrifice everything for the sake of the market? The only thing we can change are the things we've created. We can't manage the world. We don't know enough. But we can manage ourselves. So I said, Mr. CEO, if you would agree with everything I've said now, if you will shake hands with me, I will do everything I can to help you and your company. And what do you think he did? He couldn't possibly shake hands with me. He was a good man. I know that he went to church every Sunday. He loves camping, takes his kids camping on weekends, but he's locked into a system. If he were to go back to his shareholders and say, I had a discussion with Suzuki and he's right, whatever our business does, we can't mess with the air, water, or soil, he'd get fired so fast because that's not his job. And so I believe the great challenge we face now is to cut that link between corporate agendas and government agendas. They should be very, very different. Corporations don't care about the planet. We know that from the behavior of Exxon, which has known for decades that burning fossil fuels is causing climate change. And yet all of their PR has said, this is junk science, it's a natural cycle, it isn't real, and so on. So that is the challenge. And I believe that, people are all into, what can I do, what can I do? Retake democracy. And we've got to really set the priority of the people we elect to office at every level on what the real things are about protecting a future for our children and grandchildren. Thank you very much.